Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to what I believe is going to be the final unit of our humanities course. So if you've made it with us thus far, if you've been following along, what we're going to do now is shift our attention out of the Enlightenment and into the 20th century, the very final unit and final period of history that we're going to cover. Now, I'm probably going to split this particular unit up into 3 videos or so. We're going to spend one video doing the first part of the notes, which is going to cover the first two world wars, right? Or the first two major conflicts of this century in some detail, in some relative detail. And then we're going to spend another video discussing the culture wars of this particular period, mostly where we see those sort of conflicts happening in America and how that kind of has reverberating effects around the entire world and for the kind of present day history that we're experiencing right now. And then we're probably going to include a third video or like a third section of this unit, just discussing the general trend of artwork and the sort of innovations that are being made on the aesthetic scene of this particular period of history. Now, let's start with the first section here. And that's on the whole subject of the world wars, the first two world wars, okay? So the world wars, both World War I, World War II, the Great War, the war to end all wars, begin and flourish as wars as a result of many different factors within the first half of the 20th century. Now, something that's important to know kind of moving into this particular study of these conflicts is that in their accumulation, they have killed more people, or they have resulted in more death than essentially, or like, and the issues, the humanitarian issues surrounding these wars have resulted in more cumulative violent deaths than I think all of the previous centuries of human history combined, I think was one of the really dramatic pieces of stats that I have ever heard. And that I usually like to try to sell to my students is something like a very traumatic period in our human history. So something was happening in this past century that is within waking memory, actually, for many of the people still alive on this planet today. Something happened during their lives and a little bit before their lives that resulted in this absolutely unimaginable, widespread, violent death, the likes of which our civilization, our planet, our species, our cultures have never seen in human history by far. And I say that and I emphasize that to my students in all of my classes and to you, because that should give us all serious pause. That should all really, really draw our attention. When we have trauma, when something traumatic happens to us, you, as painful as it is, and as heartbreaking and as deeply anxiety-provoking as it is, that deserves attention. It must draw our attention. We must address it. Otherwise, we really are essentially kind of living out that what is probably, sort of an old phrase in your head by now, but I think that really comes to its ultimate fruition here. Then if we don't emphasize these sort of things, if we don't look at these things carefully enough, we are not only doomed to repeat them, but doomed to succumb to even worse forms of them in the future. So understanding the cultural soil and the causes that helped produce World War I and World War II and all of the humanitarian crises surrounding those wars, I think is essential for us as students of the humanities. You simply must understand this. And quite frankly, I go on this discussion, I say this with as much, reservation and as much self-control as I can. But when we study, I think it's Animal Farm in 9th grade, I really emphasize to my students that the fact that we don't teach you a lot of these things adequately enough or even at all is, in my personal and professional opinion, just an immense crime of education. You need to know these things. You really, really do. Otherwise, something is very, very deeply wrong in the educational system that is not teaching you these things, if not properly or if not teaching you them at all. Something is very, very wrong therein. Okay. Now, before we jump in there, as you can sort of tell, as you can kind of see if you're following the patterns that I've been teaching you in this course, I like to understand the groundwork. I like to understand the philosophical foundations and the kind of cultural ideologies that are at play that will eventually lead to the actions and to the events that we see in the annals of history in this century. Okay. Now, some people, by the way, could take issue with me for doing that. Trying to ascribe clear-cut causes and effects, or I'm sorry, not causes and effects, but just causes for World War I, World War II, the Holocaust, the Holodomor, the purges, of Stalin, all this kind of stuff. Trying to find clear-cut causes for them, simple causes for them, is always very dubious, ladies and gents, because history is complicated. Human beings are complicated. Society is therefore complicated, and the actions of society are therefore complicated. So to simply say, oh, here's the cause, that's all we need to look at, is not wise, and that's not what I'm going to try to teach you here. What I am going to try to teach you is that the particular causes we are looking at are what I think are essential causes, or at least essential factors. That is, without these factors, the events we're going to study, these atrocities we're going to look at, simply could not happen. That you need these essential ingredients. And I think these particular ingredients that we're going to look at are, even if you want to really push me to make my argument here as an educator, I think these particular factors are some of the most, if not the most influential causes that led to these sort of atrocities. Okay. Well, what are those factors that I'm going to argue for, that I'm going to try to teach you about? They are the philosophies. They are the ideas that underpin all of the actions, that sort of help motivate all of the actions that we are going to look at in World War I and World War II and all of the crises surrounding them. Okay. So what we're going to do, and if you're following along in the notes, by the way, this is, I think, articulated in a little bit of a different order. But yeah, we're going to try to answer these particular questions in this first section. Now, what are these questions asking? They're asking, out of the whole, for number one, out of the collection of philosophies that we are going to look at right now, I want you to tell me which one you expect, or explain to me which one you expect will have the greatest influence on the 20th century. Okay. So I'm going to ask for two, actually. There's like two, right? Explain where you suspect we will see. Let me articulate this a little bit better. Explain where you suspect we will see, or which of these will have the greatest influence. All right, let me try to correct that in real time here. So for number one, explain which philosophies will have the greatest influence on the 20th century. Okay. That's what we're trying to do here. Okay. We're trying to actually understand which of these are going to really, really play the strongest and the most present role in this period of history. Okay. I don't know what's going on with my editing here. It's going all out of control. Excuse me. So that's for number one. Now for number two, what we're looking at here is, let's see. There we go. Explain what? Explain which philosophy you think is the most accurate and why. Okay, so once again, kind of like we did at the end of the Enlightenment, I'm asking you pretty clearly to tell me, well, which of these things do you think is the most accurate to the way the world is? Which one do you align yourself with the most? And explain why, okay? We're not just asking if you agree with all of them, or if you disagree with which one or that kind of stuff. I want to know which one you think is the most accurate and why. Number three, explain which of them you think had the biggest impact on the past 2,000 years and how. Okay, so which of them has been the most impactful for not just this century, but for all of history since the year zero, okay, since the 2000s. Sorry, since the first century, so in the past 2,000 years. Number 4, explain which philosophy is the least accurate and why. So which of these do you think just is not accurate to how the world really is it does not have an accurate theory of reality, okay? Now, guys and gals, good point here, good little kind of meta lesson. Like we discussed, I think when we were talking about Milton, we are not logical or moral relativists in this class or in my classroom. We are looking for the truth. We are looking for the truth as best as we could understand it. And what that means, guys and gals, is that some people, when it comes to the questions about reality, questions about the natural world, about religion, about right and wrong, good and evil, some responses to those questions can be wrong. Some of your beliefs can be wrong. Some of your views on the world can be wrong. In other words, inaccurate. So, for example, we discussed last time, or a couple of classes ago, we discussed the theories of human nature in the Enlightenment. A lot of those theories disagreed. Guess what? One of those theories, or at least a couple of those theories, are incorrect, right? Human nature, there is something called human nature. And we're trying to understand what it is. We're trying to understand, like, is it this or is it this? Is it that or is it this? You know, we're trying to figure it out. And therefore, there is a correct answer. Do we have the correct answer completely yet? I'm not totally sure, right? Even if I did, I wouldn't tell you, remember, because I don't like to share my views that much. But we need to understand that, yes, that one of these views can be wrong. And when we're looking at all the philosophies we're about to look at, some of them can be wrong. All right, that is absolutely a case. This is not a situation, this is not a classroom or a culture where I'm going to allow us to say, well, you know, it's whatever you want to do, and just kind of let everyone believe what they want to believe. No, I'm going to push you to be able to explain to me why you believe what you believe. And if you cannot do that, then that is a problem. That means that you have to either learn more, that you have to kind of explore, your reasoning more, and therefore strengthen your position, or maybe you need to amend it. Maybe you need to change your opinion. Maybe you need to change your views. And as I say at the end of our 9th grade argument unit, there is nothing wrong with that. If you explore other worldviews, ladies and gents, and you understand, or you start to learn accurately that there are some flaws in your particular worldview you hold, if it's illogical, if it's inconsistent, if it doesn't really have any intuitive sort of validity to it, then you can change it. Then you should change it. That is an okay thing. It is okay to change, to therefore admit that we were wrong and grow. There's nothing wrong with that. That's what we're going to try to do here, is look at some of these and see what we think. The first philosophy, really old one, that we see present during the 20th century, during the rise of the 20th century, is Judeo-Christianity. Okay. What, in essence, is Judeo-Christianity really teaching? What makes it a present philosophy during this period? It believes that there is a creator God, and that people, human beings, have universal rights for equality, dignity, and therefore they have individual value and should have freedom as well. And that we should have charity towards the poor and those who are suffering, okay? That's the basic one here. Now, Judeo-Christianity, as we learned earlier in the humanities, is one of the founding philosophies of Western civilization as we see it now, okay? So these basic beliefs have been permeating more and more and more throughout civilization for those 2,000 years. And obviously they've been spreading and growing and becoming more and more rooted in our civilization. Now, we saw that start to change even in the beginning of the Renaissance, really in the Enlightenment. And now here we're going to start to see it really change, right? So it's going to be, not just one philosophy being the dominant one, there are other ones as well. So next we have the emergence of religious fundamentalism, which is, as it says, a belief in a religious sacred text that must be interpreted literally or nearly literally and held as the highest authority on earth against the challenging worldviews and perspectives, often calling on followers to act very consistently with its text's teachings. Okay, So yes, a not just Judeo-Christian, religious worldview, but kind of a religious fundamentalist worldview that wants to elevate its text, its religious text, as the highest authority, its traditions, its values as fundamental to how we should behave. And I put on there, to be a little controversial, not just the Bible, but also the Quran, right? We have a lot of religious fundamentalism being a consistent factor in Islamic cultures as well. I know we haven't talked about Islam since religion, but as we become more and more globalized, more and more connected during this century, more so than any century before it, that becomes very evident, is that there is a strand of fundamentalism in the Islamic religion, more so than I think we actually saw it in Christianity. So that becomes more of a present feature even today, okay? And then we have what we were discussing in the Enlightenment, but emerging in the 20th century and becoming what we would call liberal secularism, which says what? It is a belief that humans can live a good, free, and moral life without the need for a religious belief and framework in society, as well as a strong encouragement for free expression and inquiry for individuals, okay? So again, very, very much what we saw during the Enlightenment, this idea that, we want to kind of evict and kind of move away from religion in the public sphere and allow us to kind of, work on the strands or on the bedrock of human reason and human decency and human nature, and just live out our lives thus with free inquiry and respect for individual differences, okay? That's liberal secularism. Next, we have the emergence, like we saw with Karl Marx, of Marxist communism, or kind of the form of communism that Marx was pushing, which says what? It is a belief that human society has been struggling to overthrow an oppressive upper class that uses both power and religious manipulation, and will eventually do so, that we will eventually do so, with a revolution to establish a totally equal society, right? So again, that Marxist struggle of the low versus the high, the have versus the have-nots, the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat, we will eventually kind of overcome that unfortunate strand of human pattern and human behavior, and eventually create a more equal society where we don't have to work as much, where we are not shackled by the needs of work, and we're able to kind of live in harmony, economic harmony and peace together. Now, that's Marxist communism. Now, another one that we did not totally fill out yet, is because I didn't do my homework, but the next one that we're going to see is, as we see here, nationalist fascism, okay? So national fascism, or just fascism in general, because it's kind of inherently nationalistic, emerges, later part of the 1800s, and then it really kind of pops up, and it starts to flare itself out very clearly here, is what? It is a belief, so I'm going to just write it out for you here, a belief that a government, and typically within that government, should be the single or be the kind of centralized rulers or the centralized authority in society to maintain order and stability and security at almost essentially any cost, right? So total authority, right? Total control, total centralization of government and society. This becomes a major form of government first in Italy, and then of course it spreads to Germany as well, and takes the form of the National Socialist Party, okay, Nazism, right? It's a belief that a government, and usually a ruler, a single ruler, should be the central authority in society. So complete authority should be given to that person and that party and that government in order to maintain order, stability, and security at any cost. In other words, it is an advocacy for dictatorships, all right? That's kind of what we're going for here. All right. Now, at a deeper level of culture, we have the more philosophical, aspects of culture. We have the emergence of scientific naturalism, which comes on the heels of not only the Enlightenment, but also on the heels of Charles Darwin as well. Okay, and it is the belief that the dominant power in this world exists in science, and the dominant power to explain the world exists in science, as well as to explain all mysteries therein that is in the world, as well as a focus on the empirical sources of knowledge and a celebration of the advancements and technological feats of science since the Enlightenment. Okay, so in other words, it's a belief system that looks at the explanatory power of science and national, or not national, of empirical inquiry and empirical understanding, and says that's the best thing we got. That produces more success, it produces more understanding, it produces more wisdom, and therefore it should be our prime and most kind of revered subject that we look at, right? Now, naturalism also is typically linked with atheism. So this one is particularly anti-religious to a sense, right? So to be a naturalist means that you think that we can always provide a natural, a physical explanation for things. We don't need to use God. We don't need to use God as or the supernatural as a source of explanation. And when answering the question, or when exploring the question, does God exist? Does the supernatural have any reality or validity to it? The naturalists would say no. They would say no, insofar as we could measure it and explain it through natural means. We don't need to invoke a religious reality. Okay, so atheism would kind of be underneath this one as well. So additionally, we have, since Nietzsche, and even more so towards the later part of the 20th century, we have the emergence of nihilism and existentialism. Now, nihilism is a belief that, and I think I discussed this at some point earlier in the year, but nihilism is a belief, as it says, that the world has no inherent meaning, value, or purpose, and that we must either live with this absurdity or try to create our own set of values and meaning to help us live in spite of life's meaningless and indifference. So that, of course, is what we saw with Friedrich Nietzsche. Right? Nietzsche was essentially a nihilist, and he tried in his philosophies about with the Übermensch and the post-death of God sort of world, he tried to create a man-made, a kind of humanist, an existentialist worldview where he could find his own meaning, find his own value in spite of life's inherent meaninglessness. Now, I break my rule as an educator. I break my philosophy as an educator only on this subject, and I'll tell you why in a minute. In every class, that I get the opportunity, that the subject comes up about nihilism, the subject of nihilism comes up, I will always tell my students, I do not believe nihilism is accurate. I do not believe it is true. I do not believe it is good. All right. And if you want to know why I feel comfortable saying that as an educator, go listen to my teaching philosophy video in the open or in the office hours playlist. But essentially, the reason why, ladies and gents, I don't think this is true, a number of different reasons, and I'm actually not going to go into them entirely here, but I fundamentally don't think that it's a good thing for educators to teach students, children, right, essentially, that life is inherently meaningless and that there is no good or evil, there is no purpose to life, all that kind of crap. I think it's 100% false, by the way. I think if you believe that, you're just immensely deluded and you don't understand, or you don't have a good perception of the world, at all. And I think if you teach that, that's even worse. I think if you go around teaching this to young, susceptible minds, that is a really deeply immoral thing that you're doing. I think it's false. I think it's wrong. It's not accurate. Okay, so that being said, right, those are our philosophies. So what do we got to do here? Like we said, we have to go through all of those. You have to look at all of those, and you have to answer these three questions. Okay, explain where you suspect we will see. I got to correct myself. Where we will see the influence of at least or two of these on the 20th century. Okay, where do you think these are going to sort of play out? Which do you think is the most accurate and why? Explain which you think has had the biggest impact on the 20th century, and explain which philosophy is the least accurate and why. Okay, so tell me, in other words, which of those you agree with, which of those you don't agree with. Okay, and I want to know. So, like, for example, even if you do think nihilism is correct, even though I just ranted to you, and I always will rant as to why I don't think it's accurate, go ahead and tell me why. Tell me what your issues are. Tell me why you think this is actually the case. If you think that Judeo-Christianity or any of these religious fundamentalist things, or even the scientific or secularist liberalist stuff is accurate or inaccurate, tell me why. Tell me what it is that you are thinking here. What are your reasons? Same thing with national fascism, same thing with communism. Which of these do you think is accurate and or inaccurate and why. Okay. Now, all of those philosophies are floating around the culture of Europe, the culture of Asia, the culture of the Americas, and everywhere else in the world. And as they're floating around, as they're doing their kind of give and take dance, they start to enact themselves. They start to kind of help ferment the soil of the cultures that they're in and eventually help produce World War I, the Great Depression, and World War II. Okay, less so with the Depression, but World War I and World War II for sure. Okay, so what I want to do really quickly is I want to go through all three of those conflicts, all three of those events, these catastrophes, if you want, these great catastrophes of the 20th century, and just discuss what's going on with them. Okay, I want to discuss basic understanding or basic kind of things we need to know about them before moving forward. So for World War I, the first point here, who was fighting in this war? It is a war between a variety of nations in Europe, the Entente powers, right? The kind of the US and the French and all this kind of stuff versus the Central powers, as they're sometimes called. Actually, I get those mixed up. I'm sorry. Yeah, the Central powers, if I remember that correctly, is what? See, I always get this wrong. I always get them mixed up. Now, in World War I think that was let's see what ChatGPT always wants to tell me. Yeah, Germany, Austro-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria. Okay. So yeah, the German-led part of that conflict is the Central powers. The Entente powers, I always remember that because of the French and the French names. So the French and Americans and English were on that side, whereas the Germans and the Bulgarians and everybody else on the other side. You have this immense conflict break out between several different groups of allies. Okay, that's what happens. Now, characteristics of this particular war. It lasts for around 4 years. It is the result, as you kind of can just got the preview of that, of alliances, of entangled alliances and national expansion. So as more and more nations expanded, began to grow, their economies began to grow, their societies and the government starts to change, and all of these different nations and cultures, they start to, as happens with nations, want more territory, want more resources, believe that they need more resources and territory. They start to sign more and more treaties with each other, to where if you attack one, you've attacked all of the allies. And as a result of all of these different things, of all of the growing tensions, you have the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And then in 1914, the war begins. And it's a war that lasts over 4 years and results in over 40 million people dead. Okay. Now, one other characteristic about this war was, as it says there, the time and positioning expanse. What I mean by that is that this war did expand from Western Europe to far Eastern Europe. Okay. Excuse me. And the scope and scale of it surprised everybody within the war, because the kind of cliche example, the cliche anecdote about this particular war is that the men who were going to fight in it, and the women who had to watch the men go off and fight into it, were told that the war was going to, be over within the year. Essentially, by Christmas you'd be home, and they weren't. Right? You had to stay and fight in this conflict several more years. And you would essentially be, as I think most students know, locked into trench warfare, and you'd be fighting over, cubits, square feet of advancement, slowly and slowly and slowly, to where there essentially is barely any ground gained over the course of months and years. Now, the results of this war, like I said, 40 million men and civilians dead. Okay. That alone, that war alone, becomes the deadliest in history up until that point. Okay. Now, one of the reasons for that, and this is something that's kind of interesting for us to look at, this is sort of a counterpoint to the hardcore um, focus or emphasis on ideology and philosophy as the guiding factors for these conflicts. The introduction of the industrial power and the industrial revolution's, fruits into warfare essentially made it easier for us to cause an enormous number of death on the battlefield. What with, you know, deadlier guns, gases, chemical warfare, various forms of artillery as well. All of this made mass death a much easier thing to accomplish. Okay. So the Central Powers, led by Germany, are defeated in this war. And as a result, the Entente powers penalize Germany in such a severe way at the Treaty of Versailles that Germany is essentially crippled for the next several years. Their economy is in shambles. They're not allowed to rebuild their military. It's just this incredible penalization. It's very, very harsh. Rightly so, wrongly so, I'll leave that to your discussion, but they are incredibly penalized and put in a very, very harsh and difficult position after this war. Okay, so you have almost an entire generation of young men and women scarred and killed by this event. And what this does, ladies and gents, on a cultural level, is really difficult to understate. Because you have this young generation of men going and women and families going off to war, and you had the government, all forms of government, and in many cases, the churches. So essentially, the foundational institutions, the foundational cultural institutions of your society, of your culture, encouraging you to go on this war, telling you on this war campaign, telling you that it was a good thing, telling you would be home soon, it'd be great, it'd be easy, you're going to be a hero. And then you go into this war, and it is anything but glorious. There is no glorious charging the battlefield. There is no, romantic element to it. It is harsh, it is ugly, it is brutal, it is incredibly stressful and traumatizing for everyone. It is just a horrible experience, and there's so many good movies about World War I and World War II. The most recent one that I know history teachers love to have students watch is 1917. It's a very, very good little snippet of what war would have felt like in this period. Okay, extremely stressful, extremely inglorious in many ways. And what does that do to the culture? Well, number one, you lose like so many generations or so many men in a generation that you have the scarring of many different families, many different people. You have an immense societal trauma around that. The example that I always give, because it's most familiar to me as a Lord of the Rings fan, is that a man like J.R.R. Tolkien, goes into this war, fights as a young man, and loses three of his best friends in the war. They're just dead. So just as a normative experience, I tell my students, like, imagine, my guys especially, imagine like you pick your four best friends and now kill three of them. They're gone. Like, what does that do to you? And what does it do to the parents? What does it do to the wives and the children of these men who just die off? And so seemingly in a meaningless fashion in this absolutely absurdly long, overly complicated war. It is incredibly, the word we want to use here is incredibly disillusioning, right? It is incredibly disheartening, and it causes a severe amount of distrust, very deep-seated distrust in the authorities in society, mainly the government and the church. Okay, so it really does traumatize and cripple a lot of European culture right at the beginning of the century. Okay, so that's World War One. As if that weren't bad enough, following World War I, we have the Great Depression eventually hit the world. Now, causes of the Great Depression, just like we look at the causes of the war, were what? The excessive spending, right? Spending loans, spending on interest, all this kind of stuff. The international tariffs that were kind of being spread and kind of flexed throughout the world, and the policy failures of the men and women running the governments and running the economies around the world. So all of those sort of, again, lead to a head or kind of reach a peak after several years, and then cause this incredible economic collapse throughout, particularly America, but also in Europe as well, where we have the rapid decline, as it says here, of monetary value, the mass unemployment, the widespread need for work and food. Okay. So rapid decline of monetary value. What does this mean? This means basically like you try to go and buy something for $1, and your dollar is no good. The value of your dollar is absolute trash. It's worth like 10 cents. So it's like your money. It's famously, money is used as just leaflet paper, right? In Germany at the time, right? It's just useless, right? Now, the mass unemployment leads to desperation. We have, of course, the horror stories of people committing suicide, who just have all this money saved up and then it just disappears. It's lost, right? There's no value on it anymore. And we have, the influx of populations in and out of cities, and in the infamous sort of like homeless refugee camps almost. Now, the ultimate impact of the Great Depression is actually a little bit wider than we might expect. So as it says here, there's further distrust in current regimes, social chaos, and desire for reforms. That deeper level of distrust continues to expand and to grow. Social chaos goes without saying that that's going to happen, and the desire for reforms. So some of those philosophies that we looked at earlier become more and more interesting, more and more popular, more and more attractive as a result of all of this chaos. Because what happens in chaos in civilization is that people look for stability. We look for an end to the chaos. Now, the story essentially here is that, meanwhile in Germany, right? What's happening in Germany meanwhile? A couple different things. In Germany, we have the emergence of the National Socialist Party, the Nazi Party, right? Which is not, it's really not that socialistic. It just uses that as kind of a front cover name. Like a lot of political movements do. They give you a euphemistic name that doesn't really show you what they're actually all about. So yeah, the National Socialist Party, led by Adolf Hitler and a couple of his lackeys and his disenfranchised World War I enthusiasts, are going around at this time and trying to enact political reforms. And he actually predicted a crisis like the Great Depression, such that he goes from having, I think, less than 3% of the vote pre the Great Depression to winning like over a third of the vote after the Great Depression. So unfortunately, the chaos of the Great Depression actually creates enough instability and distrust that a figure like Adolf Hitler is able to kind of rise further and further towards seizing power. And we, of course, know where that's going. That's going into World War II now. Okay. So what is World War II? Okay, the most deadly war in all of human history. That's what it is. Now, who fought in World War II? The Axis powers, okay, the axis of evil, as we would call them here in America, which is an alliance between Germany, Italy, and Japan. Now, that would be Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, and imperial Japan. Okay, so 3 countries that are adopting a very nationalistic, a very fascistic way of operating, where they are going to seek to expand and conquer more and more land to further strengthen their power and their grip on their nation's control, on their nation's population and their nation's power. These 3 powers fight against the Allied forces, as we would call them here in America, which are the USA, a representative democracy, a republic, and then Great Britain as well, and surprisingly also the USSR, okay, the Soviet state of Russia. Now, an interesting cultural shift is going to happen, an interesting kind of cultural alliance is happening there. And we'll talk about that more when we discuss the Cold War. But just keep this in mind that it's a little bit strange that Russia is actually on our side in this war so far. So this war breaks out as a result of Hitler annexing, conquering more and more countries near Germany to the point where he actually invades Poland. And Great Britain, after a number of attempts to get him to stop, or a number of attempts at peace talks and warnings and all this kind of stuff, finally is backed up against the wall and says to Germany, essentially, if you do invade Poland, we are going to declare war on you. This is too much. And they do. Britain declares war, and then we have World War II break out. So what are the characteristics of this particular war? Number one, massive body counts. Okay. The scale of death is incredible in this particular war. Now, the other unique feature of this particular war is that civilians are targeted in this war openly, okay, on both sides. Now, you can play the whole war crimes game and I'll talk about this, but it is a fact, ladies and gents, that the Axis powers were the aggressors of this war, did begin this war, and did target civilians, okay? Japan targeted American civilians. Germany targeted French and British civilians. That's how it started. Fortunately or unfortunately, welcome to the debates on war. The Allied powers responded in kind and also attacked civilians as well. The effort, or the kind of defensive reason people would say that, is that they did it to end the war, to break the morale of the opponents, or of the other side, the enemy, as quickly as possible. Okay, to end the war. That's what they were trying to do. We got to end this war as quickly as possible, so we don't draw it out and cause further and further death. We'll talk about why in a minute. The use of mechanized and industrial works, expands exponentially. So now you don't just have tanks, right? You have aircraft bombers, you have huge artillery guns, you have all sorts of, engines of death and warfare being employed on the battlefield now, so that, again, we can cause more and more death on a larger and larger and even quicker scale. A worldwide theater of war, which is essentially a fancy way of saying that everywhere in the world was at war, with the exception of, for instance, America. There was never a battle on American soil. Pearl Harbor, technically, it's an American territory or an American kind of base, but that's about as close as anyone ever got to America during World War II. The same cannot be said for Britain or France or Italy or Africa or China or Japan. All of those different areas in the world were being attacked, did have active warfare going on therein. So the title of World War really does fit this period of time. Now, on top of this, you have the use of bombings, ... as we kind of, very clearly are implying something there. So, aerial bombardment becomes a very typical and common feature of World War II. This starts, of course, with the bombing of France, the bombing of Britain by the Luftwaffe, Hitler's aerial air force, essentially. And he targets civilians. He targets military and civilian populations, again, in an effort to break the morale of his enemies and to conquer them completely, right? We see this in, of course, Japan, right? Japan attacks the U.S., bombs, using its air force, bombs civilians. America responds in kind and bombs Tokyo, targeting, again, civilians and targeting the military leaders in the population there to end the war as quickly as possible. We then see Britain very clearly bomb Dresden and other areas in Germany to try to, again, disrupt the war machine of Germany and stop the war as quickly as possible by disrupting the morale. Of course, this culminates in the views. I don't know if I have this. Let's see. We don't have it. Yeah, we're going to talk about it later, but we have the emergence of the nuclear bomb, of course, where America uses the first nuclear bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. killing many civilians there. Okay, thousands of civilians, tens of thousands, if I'm remembering correctly. Now, it's worth saying again for the discussion that in terms of a body count, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not theoretically unique. American bombing had already killed far more people in like bombing runs than Hiroshima and Nagasaki did. You could say, well, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were like just two separate, singular bombing runs that killed an incredible amount of people. Yeah, that's fair. That's true. But again, that scale of people, civilians and military targets, were already being destroyed uh, at that scale over a similar period of time. So what was really noteworthy about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, yes, it was the first time we invented a bomb that big that caused that much damage that quickly. Absolutely. And it's the first and only time that a nuclear weapon an atomic bomb, a nuclear weapon, has been used in warfare since their creation. Now, I always like to emphasize that, the Oppenheimer movie kind of talks about this a little bit, by the way. And if you go study Oppenheimer, you just study the use of the atomic bomb. There's one aspect of this war that we are not totally clear about, or we're not totally, taught that much in school, which is that everyone was trying to get the bomb. Everyone was essentially racing for this. There was a very clear arms race to get the atomic bomb. Germany had people working on it. Britain had people working on it. Russia definitely had people working on it. I don't know what the whole story was with Italy and all this kind of stuff, but I know that other people were working on this. So essentially, you have these varying different armies and nations vying for this weapon that would allow them to have an incredible advantage in warfare. Now, I like to play the what if game with my students and ask, what if Germany got the bomb first? What would that look like? Germany gets the atomic bomb. Where are they going to use it? Probably. I would assume that they would immediately drop it on London, right? They would just destroy, level London, right? This century, millennia old city gone, right? Destroyed by Hitler. Hitler would have no qualms, I think, about using that. Or he would use it on Russia. He would use it on Moscow, right? So again, just causing like immense death very, very quickly. Same thing with Russia. If Russia gets it, what's it going to start doing? It's going to just drop nukes all over Germany. And then what's it called? Japan. What would Japan do if they got it? They would drop it all over China. China would be destroyed, and they would start aiming for America and Russia as well. So that is a scenario that all of these leaders, all of these generals, all of these war teams would have known and been talking about. So I like to add that into the equation when we're thinking about why are people bombing civilians in the first place? Why is this going on? And not that I'm advocating for it at all, not that I'm advocating for anything like that. I think that it is a war crime and it should be understood as such. But to add to the complexity and add to our understanding of the nature of this war, people were rapidly trying to cause mass death in a way that we haven't seen in the modern era before, right? So the fact that Hitler is behaving like essentially a figure out of, the ancient warfare of like the conquerors, he's trying to conquer Europe, is something so foreign to many of the figures here. They had not seen a figure like this except out of the history books. Same thing with Russia, as we're going to see in a little while, right? The ambitious expanse, the malevolent kind of nature of these people is just unheard of. And so, for example, the defenders of Churchill will usually say, well, Churchill saw this very early on, and he knew that Hitler was trying to get this weapon, this bomb. And so what he was trying to do to defend everyone else was end the war and stop Germany as quickly as possible. And the only way to do that was to start targeting civilians, essentially, that he just needed to stop the war as quickly as possible. Otherwise, something very, very terrible was going to happen. So there's this urgency, there's this kind of deadline, right? You need to kind of stop it as quickly as possible. And therefore, they did what they did. They targeted civilians, they killed men, women, and children indiscriminately at times. Now, look at the way they did it. They tried to stop it. They tried to, give flyers and say, look, we're going to bomb this area, get out of here, all this kind of stuff. It still is a very controversial and very hotly debated topic, but I like to always throw that in there as because it was something that I was never taught, for example, and I see a lot of students aren't taught that's the dynamic kind of underneath the debate, underneath the war. You have on one hand people who very actively, very malevolently want to conquer you. They want to have complete conquering power over you, dominion over you. And on top of that, they are trying to get a weapon that will cause them or will allow them to inflict mass death and destruction very, very easily. Okay, that's what we're essentially fighting against. So that again changes the equation a little bit, but might not change your answer, but it just informs us a little bit more. What are the results of this war? 55 million soldiers and civilians dead. Okay. Once again, more death than World War I, an immense loss of human life, an absurd loss of human life. We also have the complete destruction and division of Nazi Germany. It is annihilated, right? There is a complete unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany. All of its leaders are either killed, go deep into hiding, or are tried and executed or imprisoned. It is gone, right? It's just not there. Italy is defeated. Fascist Italy is defeated. Mussolini is killed, executed by his own people, all this kind of stuff. And then Imperial Japan surrenders not long after the atomic bombs are used on them, right? So the Axis powers are completely destroyed and completely defeated. That's the results here. Okay. Now, looking on your notes, we took a bunch of notes. We took the basic points on the wars and the major conflicts here. Now what we're going to do is we're going to have a little bit of research, have a little bit of discussion on the human rights violations of the 20th century, because I personally think that alongside the wars, which are awful and malevolent in their nature, there is also something even more wicked happening underneath the wars, which are the human rights violations happening during, before, and after these wars. Now, what I want us to do here is what it says here, essentially. We need to choose 3 of the atrocities we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about a few, but choose 3 of them to research and provide the total number of people murdered, the targeted group, and the perpetrators, okay? So how many people were murdered? Who is being targeted, and who are the ones targeting them? And what you think were at least 2 causes of these atrocities. Then, at the end, I want you to, we're going to get here again, we're going to talk about this at the end, identify and explain at least 3 major causes or contributors to why this century that we're talking about was the bloodiest in recorded history. Why is this such a violent and atrociously horrific and traumatic century for the human civilization, for human cultures? So to start, I think we have, let's see, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 8 human rights atrocities during the 20th century we're going to talk about here. Okay, so let's start. And I'm not going to go through them in all detail. I'm going to give you a couple little blips about each one. And then just like with the novels last time, I'm going to ask that you go and research them and complete that chart at your own discretion. So first and foremost, the Armenian genocide. The Islamic Empire attacks Christian civilians in the land, in the country, in the region of Armenia, okay? Tries to completely wipe out the population of Christians there. Usually, this one was a little bit controversial when I was growing up because there was a lot of people that were denying it. There were people that were wanting to say this did not actually happen. There was a really strong push from a lot of sympathetic groups to say that, no, this actually never happened. There's no evidence that it happened. Ladies and gentlemen, it did. The Armenian genocide is a very well documented human rights violation and war crime that happened very clearly under the Islamic Empire. Okay. Then we have the rape of Nanking, okay, where we have Imperial Japan, its attack and atrocities on Chinese civilians. Okay, this is actually happening before World War II, as was the Armenian genocide. A fair warning on this one. I usually tell my students, when you research the rape of Nanking, be prepared to have your stomach turn and to be ill from this particular one. The type of atrocities and the type of violence that we see here is very, very grotesque on civilians, okay? Talk to me about this one if you choose this one. It is, in my personal opinion, one of the most graphic and most grotesque of all of the atrocities that we look at here. Next, we have a kind of combination of them: the Russian Revolution, the Holodomor, and the Great Terror. What is essentially known about this, guys, is that it is the second biggest sequence of mass killing in human history. The atrocities that happened under communist Russia towards its own civilians are unheard of, are absurd in the number of deaths that they caused. Now, there's always going to be people that want to argue about this one and say, well, actually it was this many millions. It wasn't 50 million. It was actually 45 million. It was actually 30 million. It was actually 20 million. That's only how many people died. It's like, okay. The main point, guys, is how many people needlessly died, were executed, or starved to death as a result of this government's actions, direct actions. The number is at minimum 50 million. Okay. The Russian Revolution kills millions of people to start out with. Kills and murders, right? Not just kills in the battlefield, but also murders. The Holodomor, the starvation of the people in the Ukraine, kills about 10 million people, men, women, and children starved to death therein. And Stalin then kills over 10 to 20 million people during his regime, usually through execution, working to death, or torturing them to death. Okay, just this absurd amount of death happening here. To be quite fair, to be quite honest, this is something my students just do not usually know. We are not usually doing a good job teaching students about the atrocities of communist Russia. It is one of the most graphic series of war crimes, not even war crimes, series of human rights violations that we just don't acknowledge very much. We don't really look at it in all that much detail. And so, again, as an educator, I think that that's wrong. I think that we absolutely need to be very much aware of that. We need to focus on that directly, okay? There's one more above it, by the way. Like I said, it's only the second largest one. The third largest one was, of course, the Holocaust, right? Hitler's treatment of not only the Jews, but also the people who he deemed as unworthy, as quote unquote enemies of the state, right? Romanian people, the Romani rather, and Jehovah's Witnesses, Blacks, Catholics, all this kind of stuff, just people, gays, like LGBTQ community people. He targeted them all, right? And they were all worked to death or executed outright in the Holocaust, okay? That's one that, of course, we usually have much more familiarity with. And one of the things I like to emphasize to my students is the why. Why is it that we know and we focus so much on the Holocaust, but we sort of overlook the Russian Revolution and basically all of the ones we're about to look at here? Why do we not learn about those? We really learn about the Holocaust when, in a pure numerical sense, we can definitely say, oh, Stalin and Mao Zedong killed way more people, murdered way more civilians than Hitler. Like, it was a joke. Hitler was like, leagues behind these people with how many he was murdering. Well, first of all of them should be known and studied, right? There's any human rights atrocity, even if it's one person, should be studied and should be known. Absolutely. The problem, I think, lies in two different factors, 2 points as to why we really know a lot more about the Holocaust than we do the Russian Revolution and the atrocities of Mao. Number one is that the nature, the reason why Hitler was targeting people, was wiping people out, is very anathema to us over here in our culture. Remember what I was saying during the Renaissance, during the medieval period, the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, is that the Western civilization of Europe and America was really formed in a very Judeo-Christian sort of cultural soil. And so, like with the abolitionist movement and the women's rights suffrage movement and all this kind of stuff, and even the Declaration of Independence, all of this, it was very much infused and colored by Judeo-Christian values, very distinctly than other philosophies in the world or in the ancient world. And built into that philosophy is a very anti-racist mentality, like we talked about with slavery. A Judeo-Christian philosophy and religion is deeply anti-racist. And so when you end up having someone like Hitler come along who is incredibly racist to the extreme, wiping people out, murdering men, women, and children simply because of their race, that sticks out for us. That really, that we can see that very vividly as something we don't like. And we're like, whoa, this is a figure who's totally against our most fundamental values as a culture. Again, even if you're a Christian or a Jew or an atheist or whatever, you still, growing up in this culture or in this civilization, you still are imbibing or like feel the roots of that anti-racist mentality, that anti-racist value system. And so when you see someone like Hitler, who is completely against all that, he absolutely looks like this very anathema, very kind of like, oh my God, like out of left field, something out of like a horror story from the ancient world. That's one reason. So just the kind of the reason why he's focusing on this. The other reason, guys and gals, unfortunately, is that alongside his own behavior, his own kind of nature, the way that he was doing this kind of mechanized, racist way he was doing this, we have inherently in the West a little bit more sympathy, therefore, for the communist system. And the way that the communist atrocities were happening was much more covert, right? It was much more quiet. It was not really happening on the kind of brash scale that Hitler was doing it. Hitler, like, in the Nuremberg trials and all this kind of stuff, they were open about it. They were like, yeah, we absolutely were doing this. They're enemies of the state. We were trying to kill them. We actually started killing them even faster once we knew we were losing the war. Whereas in the communist system and in both Germany, I'm sorry, in both Russia and China, it's less so. It's quieter, right? It's with starvation, right? Very much knowing that they're starving their people to death, but not openly and not kind of shouting about it. They absolutely tried to suppress the news of what was going on there. Additionally, the executions, the murders, happening quietly in distant work camps and the very edges of Siberia, or having quietly being executed in work camps or in bunkers, all this kind of stuff. It didn't happen to the scale or the kind of the brash mechanized industrial way that Hitler was killing people. So there's that. Additionally, and I think this is a little bit more of an edgy idea, but I think it's got some validity to it. There's a little bit more, as we're going to see in the next video, there's a little bit more inherent sympathy towards communism, even if we don't like it, even if we disagree with it. There's at least a little bit more sympathy towards it than there is towards something like Hitler's intense racism, right? We look at something like Hitler's racism, we're like, no, that's wrong. That's totally evil and wicked, right? Because again, our roots come from this deeply anti-racist kind of belief system. Whereas you look at communism, and in its roots, at least, it's trying to address human inequality. So you see how, like, at least at its root, we could be at least a little bit more attracted to that or a little bit more sympathetic to it. So I think there's something there as to why we don't focus on it as much. But I could be wrong about those. There could be additional factors. That's a possibility. But I generally think that's got something to do with it. So what are those atrocities? What are the other ones besides Russia? Well, the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution of Mao resulted in upwards of over 60, some people will say 70 million people, 70 million civilians starved and executed under Mao's purges, under Mao's, cultural revolutions. And I think the three body problem depicts, actually, this is the first time I ever saw it depicted in any sort of popular literature, popular piece of artwork was on that series and in that book. So go check that out if you want to get a little flavor of that. But yeah, an immense and an unimaginable amount of death happening in China at this time through mostly starvation. And the quotes coming from Mao are just grotesque when he finds out, sir, there's millions who are starving. He's like, oh well, they're peasants, we have millions more. Just completely dehumanizing way of looking at these innocent people that he was starving to death. Additionally, you have the Cambodian genocide, where the Khmer Rouge had the communist system of Khmer Rouge was overtly, targeting its civilians and executing its civilians. And then finally, of course, for this page at least, we have the treatment and the behavior of both Fidel Castro and Che Guevara in their revolutions. And I always get into, again, a little bit of a fun, controversial, educational tit for tat, because some educators that I had even growing up, or that even I had in college, are very sympathetic towards Che Guevara. I'm sure you've probably seen someone with this mug on their t-shirt. or on their backpack or on their wall or something, thinking that he is a symbol of sort of a sexy South American revolutionary, freedom fighter. Yeah, only on the surface. When you actually look at the behavior of this man and what he did, he was a murderer. He absolutely murdered civilians, executed civilians in in an attempt to both enact Fidel Castro's orders and in an attempt to bring about what they thought was their communist utopia, their revolution in South America. So be careful, right? Be careful who we hold up as freedom fighters in this world today, guys. A lot of them might be a lot less impressive and a lot less noble than we actually think they are. Okay. And of course, the final one is the use of, what do you want to call it? The atomic bombs by America in World War II. So we use these weapons, we create these weapons, we use them on military targets that are also very much civilian targets in many different ways. And an immense debate breaks out in America and throughout the rest of the world as to whether or not this was justified, right? We killed thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of people. And then of course, more people die in the fallout, more people are maimed and scarred and deformed and stricken with cancer and these other horrible things after the use of these bombs. Was this justified? It didn't bring World War II to an end, okay? But was it justified? Now, what's even more interesting is in some sense, is the question of, well, now what's the world like? Because shortly after we created the bomb, Russia gets the bomb. And then, you fast forward several decades to now, the present day, where the majority of powers in the world have nuclear bombs, have warheads. And they're way more deadly than they were during Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So we have these incredible and unimaginable weapons of destruction. And I usually ask my students the question, has this made the world safer? Do they act as a deterrent now? Or are we kind of just sitting and waiting for someone as crazy as Hitler or crazier to get the bomb and use it on someone? Okay. So the atrocities of the bombing during World War II, the atrocities of all of these different communist regimes, the atrocities of Hitler, and the atrocities of the rape of Nanking and the Armenian genocide are what you have to choose from in this particular assignment. Okay. So research and tell me what it was that caused these particular incidents. Okay, yeah, look in a little bit more detail than just say, oh, it was communism or it was fascism. No, give me a little bit more. Give me a little bit more. Who were the ones that were targeted and how many people were targeted overall? Okay. Tell me, finally, to end this particular part of the lesson or this particular part of the unit, what are the three major causes or contributors to why there was so much death in this particular century? I'll give you a few, but you got to tell me again, three major ones. Some of them that start out with are these. Some to start out with are these, rather. Number one, you have a massive increase in population. Okay, population is increasing, exponentially at this point, and so you could say, well, when you go to war, there's going to be a lot more people in war. There's going to be a lot more people to target. So that's the thing. You also have the advent, like we talked about, of industrialized weapons of war. So you create more weapons that can kill more people in a shorter amount of time. Therefore, a lot more people are going to die. That's possible. Absolutely, that's another feature. You have the increase of, or the advent of new weapons, such as the nuclear bomb, the atomic bomb, and then you have chemical warfare as well. So all of this, contributes to the issues leading to these mass deaths. You also have policy failures and policies that are being enacted, and natural disasters like the starvation or the famines that happened in India at the time under the British rule. You have all these sort of things that happen that seemingly are they direct conscious results of people's or direct results of people's conscious decisions? Possibly, maybe not so clear. And I think you also have the advent of different ideologies coming on the scene, different political systems. So you have, like we talked about, the beginning of the 1900s with the emergence of the Russian Revolution. You have communism breaking out and having a revolution in Russia that immediately starts killing a bunch of people, right? So that happens. You have the emergence of fascism all the way throughout Europe. really kind of spurring on all of World War II, right? The expansion of globalism is another factor. It causes more and more people to create those alliances that ended up sparking World War I. So that's a factor. The fact that more and more people are globalized, more and more alliances are involved. So now it's not just a war between, France and Germany. It's a war between France and America and, Britain and Germany and Bulgaria and all these other guys. So it's more people being drawn into conflicts because of these alliances and this bigger globalization that we see happening in the world. And then we also have, what would you want to say? The further spread of communism throughout the world in the form of how we see it in China and Asia, rather, and then all throughout South America as well, and Africa too. So a lot of different factors there that help contribute and cause to the overwhelming amount of people who died on the battlefield and the overwhelming people who died in their homes or in prison camps, and as a result of targeting civilians, either through bombing or through imprisonment and torture and working to death or execution. Okay. So tell me, what are the three big factors? What three things really contributed the most to why this century was the bloodiest century in human history? Okay. We need to understand it. We need to really get it clear. We need to be deeply familiar with why these things happened. I will say this, and then we'll kind of conclude. I don't really like, it's one of my frustrating points about people who debate nowadays, who discuss things nowadays. We like to throw, accusations around about communism, accusations around about Hitler and Germany and all these other, atrocities and the bombings and the atomic bombs without really understanding the full context of those situations. Am I saying that because I want to justify everything that was just done? Absolutely not. I'm saying we need to understand the context so we understand distinctly the nature of why those things happened. Because if we really are familiar with the nature of those things, we won't have this kind of simplistic way of seeing vaguely similar, but simplistic signs nowadays and say, oh, see, this person's Hitler, or this person's a communist, or this person's, this is going to break out World War III again. It's like, it's more complex than that, right? We need to be familiar with those things. So familiarize yourself with some of those atrocities, report on them above, and then tell me your conclusions herein so that we can start to begin the process of learning a little bit more about this horrible century. Now, next class we're going to do is explore the culture wars that break out, because after the even after the Cold War, we're going to have more and more cultural divisions and more kind of conflicts in this century. So we will do that next time. And I thank you for all of your attention, and I hope that you enjoy as much as you can, or at least enjoy the process of learning more and more about this very dark and dim and grim period of history. But I hope you can find some use in it as well, so that we can stop making these mistakes, or at least make less and less of them as we go forward. Alrighty, I will see you next time. I hope you have a wonderful day in the meantime. Bye.